I'm Jennifer Hill. My great pleasure to be moderator for this session. I think it's going to be a great session. The papers, I think, fit so well within some of the themes that we've already been seeing in this conference. Themes like leadership, CSR, socially responsible investing and stakeholderism. And I didn't know either of the speakers for this first session, I didn't know Rui or John, and in the second session I didn't know Davidson or Ellen, but just fortuitously last night I got to sit opposite Rui at dinner and next to Davidson, so I now know quite a lot more about them after that delightful dinner in the that fabulous hall. So thank you, Elaine, for organising that, and over to you now, Rui.
Thank you. It's not on. Is it okay? Can I go? Oh. So thank you very much for the organizers for putting the paper in the program. It's a fantastic opportunity to present the paper. The paper has been on the road for like 2-3 months, so it's brand new, and so we need a lot of all feedback is greatly welcome. And thank you, John, for reading the paper. So this is joint work with Luis Cabral at NYU. So let me tell you, the next slide we probably don't need, for this audience, probably we don't really need it, but there was some controversy yesterday with Elizabeth. So let me tell you kind of where we're coming from, the way that we're thinking about this. So we're going to take CSR as a management concept whereby companies achieve a balance of economic, environmental, and social imperatives, the triple bottom line approach, while at the same time addressing the expectations of shareholders and stakeholders. This is the United Nations current definition. So Tirole in his book puts it as, creation of value and accountability. If this quote, one of the first rule of civility from George Washington, every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. So kind of more or less in the spirit, I think, of what CSR suggests. So anyway, so the CSR idea is, there's something more than just looking at expectations of shareholders, and in particular, there's a balance between economic, environmental, and social imperatives. Okay. So what is the traditional theories that have looked at kind of reasons for which it might make sense to look into CSR, why that might be optimal. And so some of these answers are, people look at them in the context of shareholder value maximization, and in a way, the way that, when I look back at those papers, they really look like, just people doing what they're supposed to be doing, like just being managers, better managers in a way. So you should really be looking into the long term as opposed to being short-term managers. That sounds like something that's good in any way. You should really be, paying attention to your customers, to your employees. That sounds like it's something that's really good that you should do independently anyway. And so it's just like, in a way, it's like looking at the low-hanging fruit that we're not quite aware of, but we should be aware of. And so somehow, maybe corporate purpose introduces that kind of connection that kind of makes us aware of these other dimensions that we should have been aware, but somehow we're not. And so that's kind of the way that I view this traditional approach. So we're going to add to that traditional approach in 2 separate ways, complementary ways. One is that often what companies do is not independent of how their competitors respond, and so there's strategic interactions between firms, and so looking at the firm in isolation may give you an incomplete picture of what firms can actually do and accomplish. And the other is that when you think about strategic interactions, then that's kind of a normal setting to think about externalities, okay? And so a partial equilibrium approach normally prevents you from introducing externalities into your analysis. This gives you an opportunity to think about those externalities and how firms and firms' interactions can deal with those externalities, which I think is an important aspect of what we think that CSR could accomplish, okay? And some of the difficulty that CSR, like if you're thinking specifically about shareholder value maximization, maybe you're not going to pay much attention to the externalities. Well, that's precisely the context that you want to think about creating value with social responsibility. So what do we do? So we argue that strategizing over CSR policies is kind of choosing your price or quantity in the product market. So in a way, it's kind of choosing your strategic variable. But it's very different in one particular way, because CSR really transforms your objective function. So in that sense, it's not just about some strategic variable. It's choosing your objective function that then influences, percolates all the way through your strategic variables, okay? And so we're going to assume that firms have this ability to choose an objective function, call it their mission statement, their view, whatnot. That includes profits as well as other goals, okay? And because the status quo is of profit maximizers, we're going to think of firms as profit maximizers choosing to adopt a different value function, choosing to become stakeholders as opposed to continue to be shareholders, value maximizers. All right, so big slide. So the two things that we think about in this paper are firms acting strategically and there being strategic complementaries, these externalities that I was talking about. Okay, so here's 3 examples of what I think about in terms of these strategic complementaries. So the one that I'm going to be talking today is this adoption of clean technologies. Think of this as, if I'm the sole firm adopting a clean technology, my costs are going to be very high. Everybody else is going to continue with the legacy technology with low costs, and I'm probably going to be driven out of the market because my costs are so high. Okay? But if everybody adopts the clean technology, okay, imagine there are non-excludable learning by doing gains. Like the more we do it, the better we are at doing it, and actually this is knowledge that everybody can benefit from. In that case, we can all lower the cost for everybody, and we can all benefit from this. So this is where the externality comes in, okay? So examples are, cost savings in solar panel manufacturing. If you think about, the market for carbon credits, the more firms participate in this market, the more investors participate, the more liquid the market is, that benefits everybody. So there's a lot of network benefits associated with the presence of more people around. So that's one idea. Where these strategic complementaries might be coming from. Another example is sometimes the reputation of a firm is tied to the reputation of the industry. Okay, and so imagine the diamond industry. Okay, so when the diamonds were all bloody, right? Like you might refrain from buying a diamond because you'd be buying a blood diamond. So you would say, oh, I don't want to participate on that. Okay. Now, a firm independently might do something to, not be a firm, trading on blood diamonds, but that might, if customers are not aware of what firms are doing individually, they might just be aware of what the industry is doing. They might miss out on this thing. So you need the whole industry to change in order for the customers to become aware. If that's the case, then again, you have one of these strategic complementaries. You need everybody to, be on board on this particular thing so that demand increases and everybody benefits from it. One single firm doing it is going to have a lot of cost and no benefit. Another example is supply chains. For example, think about a firm that wants to do like Unilever with Lipton tea, right? So you want to do a sustainable tea, right? So what you need all of the supply chain to be sustainable. So it's not your actions independently that will going to give you that that sustainable tea. Is you have to convince everybody else along the supply chain to do the same. Otherwise, the thing doesn't work. So you're not going to go anywhere. So these strategic complementaries, you need the actions of everybody to actually take the benefit. Individually, you're not going to go anywhere. All right, so here's the game. It's a very simple game. Okay, so imagine 2 firms, I and J, 2 stages of the game. So in the first stage, firms are profit maximizers. They get to choose whether they want to continue to be profit maximizers in the second stage, or they want to be stakeholder maximizers. Okay, and so there's this parameter theta. They either choose 0. And so there'll be a Friedman firm, so a shareholder value maximizer, or they can choose a theta upper bar and they become a stakeholder value maximizer. Okay. In the second stage, they have this value function. So they maximize profits plus a component that goes over and above profits that is dictated by the choice of theta in the first stage, right? So if they chose theta equal to 0, this component is not there. They're strictly profit maximizers. If they chose theta equal to theta per bar, then they're going to put some weight over in the above profits, and that's going to be an indication of what's the trade-off. How much are they willing to lose in terms of profits because they have this other benefit laying around, right? And in this game, in this particular game of technology adoption, we're going to have a third stage where firms, play a kernel game. So here's the externality. This externality is very simple. So it's what I was telling you. If firm I is the sole adopter of the technology, firm I's costs are going to be C per bar. The other firm, since it's not adopting, is going to have a lower cost. That's the legacy technology cost, just C. But if both firms adopt the clean technology, then both firms are going to have a cost C lower bar. And C lower bar is lower than the cost of the legacy technology. That's the benefit of everybody adopting this technology. All right. So this is in the third stage of the game. Just says that depending on the cost structure, firms could have different costs. Since one firm could have adopted the technology, the other might not adopt the technology. What's your profit from that outcome? Or both firms adopt the technology, or neither firm adopt the technology. So there's different outcomes, and so we can construct the profit functions that way. Doing the backward induction to solve the game, let's look at the second stage of the firms. So the second stage is you've chosen already what you want to be. Either you chose to be a profit maximizer or a stakeholder value maximizer. And so now, you choose whether you want to adopt the technology or not, okay? And so suppose that you chose to be a Friedman firm, a profit maximizer, okay? So theta equals 0. Basically what these slides say is that we chose conditions such that the status quo of staying with the legacy technology is a dominant strategy, okay? That's why we're here. Firms are not doing it, okay? And so we're just assuming that the status quo is firms on their own don't have the financial incentives to do it, okay? They need something else, okay? So that's what these assumptions tell you. Basically it says if the other firm is not adopting technology, you also don't want to adopt the technology. If the other firm is adopting the technology, you're going to look at them and say, that's fantastic that you adopt it. I'm going to not adopt the technology. I'm going to drive you out of the market. I'm going to be the monopolist on the market and make a lot of money. Okay, so these conditions here say that it's optimal to stick with the legacy technology independently of what the other firm does. Okay? And so this sets the problem as really a prisoner's dilemma problem. You're in a situation where you'd like to move away from this equilibrium because there's a technology out there that's better. You can't do that. You can't achieve that. Okay? So that's that. So this is if the firm I chose in the past in the first stage to be a Friedman firm. So suppose now firm I chooses to be a stakeholder firm, okay, a CSR firm. If the other firm now chooses not to adopt the new technology, okay, then we're going to say that if you're the one choosing the new technology when the other firm is not choosing the new technology, then you're going to have a high cost relative to them. They're going to drive you out of the market, okay? You're going to, not have any profits since you're not going to sell anything. The only thing you're going to have is, out of your objective function is this theta per bar, right? We're going to say, it's not your incentive to sacrifice that much of a profit, right? The alternative would be you just stick with the legacy technology, you share the legacy duopoly profits. That's better than your theta per bar. So you would not want to adopt the new technology if the other firm is not adopting, even if you said you're a CSR firm. Okay? If the other firm is adopting the new technology, and here's the interesting thing, is we're going to impose conditions such that it actually now is better to also adopt the new technology, okay? Because what happens is, if you stick with the legacy technology, you would be the monopolist. Since the other firm is adopting the new technology, you'd be the monopolist, you get these high profits, but by going with the new technology, with the other firm also going with the new technology, you get to lower the costs, increase quantities, increase prices. That's not enough to make you do this, but together with this theta per bar, then you might want to do it, okay? And so this basically says that, there's some conditions on theta per bar. Theta can't be too low, cannot be 0, right? You'd be a Friedman firm. Also cannot be too high. You cannot be willing to trade off all the profits in order to, just to be a CSR firm. It would be just too much of a warm glow type of thing to be worthwhile doing, okay? But basically what happens if you chose to be a CSR firm in stage 1 is you're gonna do whatever the other firm is doing. So if the other firm is not adopting, you're also not adopting. If the other firm is adopting, you're also gonna be adopting. Okay, so that's gonna give you 3 equilibria in this model. One is if both firms are Friedman firms, then no one adopts a new technology and you're back on the status quo, okay? If firms become CSR firms, then you have 2 equilibria. One where both firms end up adopting the new technology. That's the success of CSR. And you also have an equilibrium where both firms choose not to adopt the new technology. That's kind of the failure of CSR, if you will, right? The point here is that the equilibrium B, this one where they become CSR and adopt the new technology, should be preferable by firms because it's actually an equilibrium that raises profits for everybody. Okay? And the reason why it raises profits for everybody is because there's this externality that you're capturing by everybody moving to the same green technology and lower costs. All right. So one interesting feature about this is, if you look at this, there's basically, forget about equilibrium C, there's basically 2 equilibria in the first stage of the game. There's no reason why firms might want to choose one versus the other. So this problem becomes it's transformed from a prisoner's dilemma problem into a coordination problem, right? Now you have 2 equilibrium, how do you choose? And the way to think about that is, one of the firms could take the lead and say, well, I know that this equilibrium is better, I'm gonna move ahead, I'm going to express myself to the public as a CSR firm, and maybe others will see the light that I'm seeing as well and will join me, and then we can move on to this better equilibrium. So the coordination game, turns this into an opportunity for a strategic CSR leader. The big question, of course, there is you have to have a way of committing to the stakeholder model, okay? So commitment is really the big issue here. And so what is commitment? I mean, how do firms create commitment to CSR? None of this is bulletproof, okay? But there's an increasing number of ways that firms are using to create commitment. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So Arden and Zingales talk about mission statements as a form of commitment. They also question this, because of the business judgment rule. There's companies that call themselves B corporations and say, we really care about something else besides profits, and we'll maximize profits, but sometimes may not be doing that exclusively. There's investor preferences. There's people that have said, look, I really care about this particular issue, and I'm willing to put some money down because of that. So, one interesting example is Carl Icahn that really likes pigs, okay? And so he puts, apparently, he talked to McDonald's like 10 years ago, and McDonald's didn't do anything about it, and so now he put someone on the board and said, look, take care of my pigs because I like them to roam around and have a little bit more space and so on. So anyway, so this is the kind of thing that I think may make it a commitment more credible because it really calls to preferences of people, right? So it's harder to say that, now I don't care about pigs anymore, kind of thing. So, but another way that firms create commitment devices is by aligning, what firms want to do with what investors want to do as well. Okay, so having this matching and sorting between firms and investors, and there seems to be some evidence of that. Laura Starks talks about how ESG firms or firms with higher ratings in ESG tend to be lined up with investors that seem to be more long-term investors. And Elroy Dimson talks about how investor engagements are particularly more successful for firms that care about their reputation. There seems to be some kind of evidence in support of that. Other ways of commitment are things like, putting on the CEO compensation some criteria linked to ESG. And these criteria, oftentimes, they're very objective. It's like the level of CO2 emissions, for example. So, if you could say that, okay, so this year I put this criteria on the management compensation, next year I won't, and so commitment goes away. That's obviously possible. But, on the other hand, there's a lot of attention to what companies are doing with respect to this environment. And so once you signal that you care about those things, it probably is a little harder to reverse that. Okay, so to remain on time, I'm going to conclude. So the paper proposed the idea that profit-maximizing firms may adopt a stakeholder model via CSR policy because of strategic complementarities in the industry. In that sense, this dichotomy between purpose and profit may not be clear-cut, precisely because firms are going to extract value from these complementarities. A coordination problem arises that can be solved if one of the firms becomes a strategic leader in CSR, leading to operator improvement. One thing that I didn't talk about that I think is really interesting is, there's a role for public policy here to intervene if public policy understands that these strategic complementarities can be created by public policy. For example, subsidy policies normally are directed at individual agents, right? So if you do something, I'll give you something in return or something like this, right? So that's an individual policy. You can make it an industry policy, right? If the whole industry moves in a particular way, I'll give you something, right? So one form of doing this is the threat of industry regulation, right? So if you don't do something, then I'll move on you, right? That's an industry-wide thing that creates a strategic complementarity at the industry level. This paper would suggest that that's a useful thing if at the back of it there's some, useful purpose for it. Thank you.
Okay, John, over to you for the commentary.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be commenting on this paper because I think it's really interesting. I'm not a formal modeler. I don't even pretend to be one. And so I have to try to break formal models like this down into intuitive terms that I can understand. So let me start by attempting to do that. I think what this paper is trying to do is to propose a solution to the prisoner's dilemma problem with respect to the adoption of socially responsible corporate policies. It deals with situations in which there are social gains to be had from cooperation, but short-term incentives for individual players in a market to defect. So to put that thesis again in a little more detail, when there are gains to be had from an industry-wide transition to a socially responsible behavior, firms in an industry can overcome the prisoner's dilemma problems that inhibits them from making that transition by announcing to the world that they will adopt socially responsible policies, or more precisely, that they'll change their objective functions so as to alter what they value. Rather than valuing only profits, they declare that they'll value a mix of profits and social responsibility. That's the first period of the game, in which a firm announces a change to its objective function. In that first period, the firm doesn't necessarily commit to making a specific choice about how to operate. It doesn't decide which clean technology to adopt. It doesn't decide what wage to pay. It merely decides what it will value. It's only in the second stage, then, that the firm actually decides what to do in specific terms in its operations. As I understand it, there's two ways maybe to intuitively grasp what happens in the second stage. In the second stage, basically, firms decide how to actualize or how to act upon their values by making a specific choice, by choosing the technology, by choosing the wage. And there's two intuitive ways, I think, to operationalize what's going on. So one argument is that the prisoner's dilemma problem gets solved because other firms respond to the change in objective function in the first firm. Other firms see that the first firm has decided that it values social responsibility. And seeing that, other firms assume that the first firm will act in a socially responsible way. This solves the coordination problem and makes it possible for everyone to transition towards the better state. It's as if in the prisoner's dilemma game, one of the prisoners, before even being arrested, said, I will not confess no matter what, no matter how much evidence is presented against me, no matter whether I think you will confess, I will not confess. Well, naturally, that makes it much easier for the second prisoner not to confess himself. A second intuitive way to understand what happens in the second stage is to focus on the actions of the original firm, the firm making the commitment. So if another firm decides to act in a socially responsible way, the first firm becomes more likely to act in a socially responsible way as well, because there are no longer gains to be had from defection. The first firm has altered its objective function to value responsibility so that defecting is no longer the optimal choice. Once I know you cooperate, now my objective function has changed in such a way that cooperating is now the optimal choice for me, notwithstanding the fact that if I hadn't changed my objective function, it might have been more profitable for me to defect. So there are three examples, one about wages, one about clean technology, and one about supply chain robustness. In the clean technology example, the thought is basically that the example is electric cars. If every auto manufacturer builds electric cars, then every auto manufacturer is better off than if just one builds electric cars, because then the federal government will kick in to help build the infrastructure that makes electric cars appealing. There will be miners mining lithium, there will be charging stations along the sides of freeways and so on. There's two key assumptions on which the paper operates. The first is that there have to be gains from a collective transition to a socially responsible world, such that everyone's better off in a world in which everyone cooperates than in a world in which no one cooperates. And the second big assumption is that it has to be possible to commit to an objective function in advance in the way that will meaningfully determine choices later on. Let me just ask a few questions. These aren't critiques so much as just questions in order to clarify my own understanding and help us comprehend the limits of the model. So first is, how strong are the commitments made from objective functions? It's striking that in the second period of the game, firms that changed their objective functions in the first period to favor social responsibility can nevertheless make irresponsible choices in the second stage. That, I think, is my understanding from propositions 1 and 2. If it's possible not to behave responsibly in the second stage, after having changed your objective function in the first stage, then how strong are those commitments made in the first stage? Can we really even understand them as commitments? I think what the model's trying to do is to say, well, it merely changes the probability that a firm will act responsible in the second stage by changing what the firms value. A second question is, why the focus on objective functions rather than specific choices? Right? In the first stage of the game, a firm chooses what it will value. It doesn't choose what it will do. Why not instead focus on what firms will do? I think the answer is that in the first stage of the game, no one knows what it's even possible to do. The set of possible choices isn't fully specified in the first stage, such that all a firm can do is articulate in general terms what it aspires to accomplish, rather than to state what it will actually do. Imagine General Motors saying, we want to be environmentally responsible, rather than General Motors saying, we will build a specific number of electric cars. Because maybe in the first stage, General Motors doesn't even know that electric cars are a technological possibility. Another question is, what happens if we expand beyond duopoly? In the game, there are always just two players. Now look, this is a model. It's not a critique of the model to say that it hasn't expanded beyond its assumptions or beyond its stated scope. A model can be useful and informative, even if it's only applicable in a limited setting. But it's nevertheless useful in understanding the model to know what the limits are. And my question is, how important is it that we have just two players? It seems to me that it might be very important because, of course, cooperation is always easier as the number of people involved decreases. If there are only two people, and I know that you and me, and I know that you've made a cooperative choice, it's much easier for me to make a cooperative choice as well than if there are 10 people, and I know that only one of those people has made a cooperative choice. This is an important question, of course, because there are a few industries in the United States that are true duopolies, or really anywhere for that matter. And the final question I would have is, if the model's correct, and merely changing one's objective function could move us towards social responsibility in a wide variety of important areas, well, then why hasn't it happened? Well, one answer is, well, in fact, it has happened, right? Slowly, over the past 300,000 years, people and firms have broadcast their commitments to social responsibility in ways that, brick by brick, have built institutions like Oxford University and airplanes and COVID vaccines, such that we live in a world in which we're all able to gain the benefits of cooperation in ways that our prehistoric ancestors would not have recognized. But another answer is that, well, we still have a long way to go because making commitments is very, very difficult. In particular, it's difficult to make commitments through things like mission statements, right? If General Motors were to, the problem here, to be clear, is not that it's impossible or difficult to make a mission statement legally binding in a formal sense, right? Luigi Zangales has talked about the difficulty of the business judgment rule and so on, but I don't need corporate law in order to make something a commitment for me if I'm an American public company. All I have to do is put it in a press release. Because once I put it in a press release, there will be an army of plaintiffs' lawyers waiting to sue me if I don't do what I intend to say under the securities laws. So making commitments legally binding is easy. What's hard is to give those commitments meaningful content. Right? It's quite easy and really meaningful if I'm General Motors and I say I'm going to build 40,000 or 40 million electric cars. It's very different if I say I'm going to be environmentally responsible. That's not a meaningful commitment. It's not one that other people can look at and it's not one that will allow other people to predict General Motors' behavior. If General Motors says that it's going to behave in an environmentally responsible way, that could mean any number of things and could be interpreted in such a vast variety of ways as to devolve almost into meaninglessness. And so I guess I would regard this paper as one instance of a larger, much, much larger theme in the design and study of law, which is that coordination problems can often be solved by commitments, right? This is something I learned on my first day of contracts class. It's something I teach my students in the first day of their corporations class. The real challenge then is not to observe that commitments solve coordination problems. It's to find credible ways to help people actually make commitments. And I think the great service of this paper, in assuming that commitments are possible to be made, is to tell us what would happen if indeed they could be made, and to focus our attention on making it possible for them to be made. I would understand this paper not so much as a descriptive account of what happens in the real world as a result of the availability of commitments, but rather as a normative plea to help us make commitments more possible so that the forms of cooperation identified can be achieved. Thanks.
Thanks so much, John. We've got questions here and here.
Thank you. This is super interesting. It strikes me that you could have flipped the sign on the social benefit and called this a model of price fixing. And I feel like there's a lot of literature there, and I'd sort of be curious to hear you connect the pro-social aspects of commitment and collusion to the what we think of as negative outcomes of commitment.
Thanks. Terrific model. I found it initially very bizarre and weird to think that the first stage is I decide what my objective function is, and that's a choice variable for me. But on the other hand, as Holger pointed out, Matt Levine is always right about everything. And Matt Levine recently had this write-up about the ESG divisions at large corporations, where he said ESG divisions at a large corporation are interesting because they're an employment opportunity for employees who might be completely indifferent to or even antithetical to the core mission of the business, right? And maybe that's an example, right? If you set up an ESG division and you employ a bunch of people who their objective function is explicitly different, maybe that's a way to think about the first stage.
Thanks. Now, Rui, do you want to answer those questions? We've got two more over here. Do you want to? We'll take four.
Why don't we go for the two more
Okay,
here?
Holger.
That is practical because my comment is very closely related to Greg's and Davidson's. I mean, the model in principle, the ESG is sort of a label that you sort of stick onto it. There's a coordination problem and you can save costs. In this case, you think of it as a thing that's useful for society, but it needn't be. It could just be a cost saving for the industry, and they would like it. So then the question to me is, what makes this thing special? And I mean, I think there are things that make ESG special. So, for example, if you have something that's socially useful, the regulator is much more likely to mandate it. So stepping forward and saying, I'm doing it, well, now when usually when the legislator wants to do something, the industry jumps up and down and says, oh, no, you can't do it, it's impossible, it's too expensive. And now there's one industry player who's already done it and committed to doing it, and you can say, well, can't be too expensive, they're doing it already, right? Or consumers could, this is not in your model, but I think, these sorts of things could be added. Consumers could there's also differentiation going on. With initial differentiation, the first mover, if there's only one mover, they attract the socially minded consumers. That helps them make that first move. Once they've made that move, others can move in. That's sort of, I think, where the social element comes into your model.
So I think this is a fantastic model. I was very happy to see it. Just two comments. I think first, I think there is an analogy with the literature, theoretical literature, on choosing business strategies and committing to business strategies and the benefit that you may have that. So in that literature, for example, in Rothenberg and Saloner, I think, old paper, the benefit is different from yours, is that by committing to a particular strategy, your employees will make some investments in that strategy that could be beneficial to you. And I think this would also apply very well in this context, because you could also think of a situation that one of the benefits of committing to doing CSR is that first you're going to attract people that, want to work for you, and second, they will make these commitments because they believe in that cause. So I think there is a literature on that you may want to explore, and also think about this potential gain other than the complementarities. The second one is that, of course, commitment is a very important aspect of your model. I mean, I'm very happy with the way you did, like, to choose the objective function, but it would also be nice to think about how to endogenize that commitment a little bit. And there are two, it has been mentioned before, I think by Davidson. So the if you have like releases of information, right? So there's a literature on that as well, how releasing information in kind of career concern models can give you some kind of commitment. But another thing that I think could be particularly important, particularly relevant in your model, is that competition itself can create commitment. So there are entry deterrence incentives for you to stick to that promise. So if you choose a CSR objective function and your profits are in a way lower as a consequence of that, they might actually stop other entrants, if you're the leader in this industry, from entering, and overall your profit could be higher because you managed to deter the entrance of other things. So there are different things, I mean, that you can think of. But I think, like, as a starting point to start thinking about how people can strategically choose to invest in CSR and how they can be leaders in that, I think it's a fantastic model.
Jeff, and then it's over to Rui to respond to John and your questions, your multitude of questions.
So there's a tension implicit in this account between how CSR is done today and how we might imagine it be done in the future. So Rui suggests the way to get a socially beneficial result is to imagine coordination among firms in the way that he describes, which raise all these issues about commitment and price fixing, et cetera. Previously, in the conference today, we've just been discussing agreement between funders and CSR committed firms as the way to get it done. And what we've seen in the real world is actually that model has produced powerful results. Tesla is, of course, the great example of that. Right now, Tesla, of course, had government assistance, but basically Tesla did not get coordination, cooperation among any of the big firms before it started. It just did it. And the agreement it had was with its funders, who were enthusiasts for their own CSR reasons, consumers, who were the critical piece, and then basically there were a lot of followers who saw how much money Tesla was making. GM's decision with respect to its commitment to millions of EV cars came because they saw just they were pursuing, they were a profit maximize. They're a Friedman firm. There's no reason to think they're anything other than a Friedman firm. So the question is, and Tesla itself is a Friedman firm, right? every reason to believe that, but Musk found a consumer niche, sort of a consumer chasm or consumer peak, whatever you want to describe it, a funding, a stock market gap, but there's nothing in that story which has produced the biggest move from the adoption of clean technology that we have seen thus far that is anything other than everybody behaving like a freedman firm. And so the challenge that you've posed is basically, is there another way to get the clean technology we want that looks to cooperation at the firm level as opposed to decisions made at the funding level, decisions made at the consumer level. And I guess the questions that have been raised both as to the legality of that and also the credibility, the difficulty of creating credible commitments and that are sustainable, John's point, I think that's in a way the nicely posed issue by the story you're telling with the one that we've had earlier and has been traditionally part of the CSR funding channel, consumer channel to getting the clean technology.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for all the comments. So, let me just start by saying that, this is what we're talking about here is obviously not a panacea. Okay, so this is not going to resolve all the problems in the world. The way that we view this is, just I think calling the attention in a normative way to something that's potentially there that might be useful to think about. So that's really a tiny little contribution there. There's many solutions to the prisoner's dilemma problem. I think Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize for thinking about how creating a stage before the prisoner's dilemma where people negotiate and create a regulator that then self-regulates everybody in the fisheries and so on. This is a different way. It looks like cooperation in a way. All of these problems somehow have to look like cooperation because that's the way that you solve the prisoner's dilemma, one way or the other. And of course, every time that you talk about cooperation, you might envision that people could leave this in the wrong way, like you collude to extract rents from customers or from your suppliers or something like that. And so this should not be viewed in isolation. There's some antitrust policy and so on that could supervise what firms are doing, if it makes sense or not. So, and there's several regulators that can act on these kinds of things that they seem to be doing a reasonably good job. Again, not a panacea. There's problems associated with this idea. Commitment problems. There's always commitment problems. So even if I'm just Unilever and I'm saying, look, I want to have a sustainable tea line here and so on. Right? How do I convince everybody else to do it? Maybe my suppliers are going to do it, and at the end of the day, I back out of it. And that they made all these investments, and now I don't do it because I don't think anymore that it's profitable, right? And so this could happen, right? And so even them might not have the commitment to follow through, right? So commitment problems are there independently. Whether commitment problems, are related to supply chain, your competitors, your employees, or something. So I think they're a difficult problem. I think I'm glad, John, that you think that putting out a press release is sufficient. Companies, I don't know. We see all sorts of things. Some companies, really follow through, and others kind of, they forget about what they said the day before. And I'm not so sure that we as investors and customers are that much aware of what they, told us 3 months ago that we can penalize them that much. I tend to believe more of the industry reputation story that if there's when several firms move together, I think that tends to create an environment where, people become more aware. It's easier to relate to what, a bunch of companies are doing relative to what one single company is doing. Of course, there's Teslas in the world and things like that, but, maybe you've not heard that Volvo has made a commitment to put a speed limit on the cars by, a certain date that, cars won't go above 100 miles per hour or something. So, but maybe if everybody in the industry says that, then you'll hear about it, okay? And that may create a space for, safer cars, safer driving, less accidents, and so on. So, what else? Yeah, I think, John, you made an excellent point. I mean, why is it on the objective function and why not on strategic variables? And it may be like you're saying that sometimes, the objective that you're actually trying to achieve is not quite precisely defined when you enter into this policy, and so you may want to make it a little bit vague, right? You may not know exactly how to attack the problem, but you know you want to attack the problem. Or you might know exactly that you want to, give some more space to pigs to roam around, and so that you know exactly how to solve the problem. So that may be a little bit of a different thing, that you know what your strategic variable is and you act on it, as opposed to you know what your objective function is and you're going to find your strategic variable to get there. So so maybe there's a bit of both. So we're thinking more of the, we're thinking of the space where we're not quite yet sure. We know it's there in the future. I mean, this is kind of stepping outside of the realm of the model and thinking more broadly on, why would this matter for objective functions at the corporate level as opposed to strategic variable. Yeah, there's literature on delegation in IO. Thank you for the Rottenberg and Sellner. I'm going to look at it. I've looked at other papers, and yes, it's similar. One thing that this literature has not done, and I think maybe there's a little bit of a contribution there too, is that I mean, a lot of papers have been written where you actually change the objective function. You just say, okay, so let's say that I'm an altruistic investor and I care about profits plus something else. People have written these kinds of models before. One thing that people haven't done is, I mean, they haven't talked about the strategic complementarities, which I think is an interesting aspect specifically related to CSR. But the other thing that people have not done is they've not put it in a game where you actually choose that objective function. And the usefulness of that is that by doing so, we understand that this actually is a coordination problem. And so talking about a strategic leader comes about because we set it up in this way, which other people, just by writing down a model where the objective function is different, didn't really set it up in a way to think about this as having as a solution there being a strategic leader in the industry moving everybody to the best goal. And whether that strategic leader is Tesla or not, I don't want to go that far and push the model that far. But
we've got some more questions if you want to draw breath.
Just one more thing on commitment. I mean, I think that this is the hardest question of all. I mean, there's many hard questions over here. I think commitment is really the hardest question. John, here you could say that you want to be a high theta in the first stage. The other firm could choose to be a high theta, and then in the second stage, you step out and say, I actually don't want to be a high theta. Let's have you, I was just pretending. Let's have you choose the new technology. You're going to have the high cost. I'm going to have the low cost. I'm going to drive you out. So that's possible. We're not allowing that in the model because we're imposing commitment. But in principle, if we were not, that would be the strategy that firms would take. And so commitment is really a hard thing to do. And I mean, like Lucian Babchuk has this paper that looks at these firms that signed up for the Business Roundtable, and where there's all these promises of changing all these things, and then at the end of the day, they look at what exactly has changed, and zero. So, and that's a quite visible statement of what these firms actually committed to do, and yet they didn't do anything. So, again, I don't think there's any panacea here. I think there's a lot of effort being done. I don't think the efforts that regulators on their own, courts on their own, and governments on their own can do have helped. They've not helped in the last 40 years. And so more solutions may be needed. And so that's just one little bit solution.
Thanks. We've got Eric and then the back. Sorry, not quite. Ellen, is it? Hi, Ellen.
Hey, real quick, and this is a little bit more sort of niggly questions about the structure of the model itself. And I realize it's a stylized model, but I kind of want to get a sense of how it holds up under some of these things. First of all, on this question of would you want to think about this as choosing your objective function, but then subject to the mission drift that you were just talking about, versus just choosing to constrain your future actions by borrowing a green finance bond, right? So that you're not really changing your objective function, but you've essentially imposed a cost on yourself if you ever abandon it. And there, the big commitment problem is basically the Coase theorem, right? And so the question is, how do you figure out how to enter a contract that's robust to Coasean renegotiation? So that might be a kind of an interesting horse race to run here. The two things that I wanted to just get your thoughts on are variations in the information space and the strategy space of the game. So on the information space, if you and I are in this market and I only have conjectures in equilibrium about how likely it is that you've opted out of the Friedman and more into the crunchy firm mode, and I have some probability distribution over that, and you do as well, but we can't directly observe it, how does that change the plausible set of equilibria that come out of the model? And then the second, and it might actually be a related question, what about the strategy space? What about instead of a binary choice between 0 and theta bar, what if you had a volume knob that could be turned up? Do the equilibria unravel when you allow for that sort of continuum of strategies?
Just a point about the assumption around the cost of green technology. Absolutely true when it comes to steel, cement, autos, but it'd be great if you could correct the kind of outdated assumptions around electricity generation, which is now, renewables are cheaper now than other technologies. So I think your paper is really interesting. I just wouldn't want it to contribute to that misconception, which might actually be one of the barriers to adoption in that sector.
Yes, but I guess you already somehow answered it, because it was related to the idea that these firms can default on cash flows, but also default on purpose, right? And but I guess you addressed this already.
So I don't know what would happen if we were to allow for strategies to be different. But you asked a separate question. So besides the probability assignment of what the other firm is doing, you asked a separate question. Can you just remind me briefly?
I think I may have asked 3, pretending like
The
they were
last one.
So the strategy space, continuous strategy space, or
so
asymmetric information about whether you've made a commitment or not.
Yeah. So I don't know what the solution is to the asymmetric information. There's models that look at reputation. You take the role of other people and you play pulling equilibrium where you pretend to be what the other. So I think there is an interpretation of our setting that is like that. Here the theta is known. You either choose it or don't. I guess the interpretation there would be, I don't actually know what you are, but we could be playing a game where you choose to pretend to be a CSR firm, and we just go along with that, playing a pulling equilibrium. So, but that's as much as on the continuous choice of theta. The third model actually has we have like 3 different little models in the paper, and the third one is a supply chain problem, and you can think of this as this Lipton type thing, or we actually, the problem. We started thinking about this in the context of supply chain problems, disruptions with the COVID crisis, and why were supply chains not working. And the idea was that, I could be making a big investment, but if the other firms don't make a sufficiently big investment as well, then the supply chain is going to collapse anyway. And there we actually allow the theta to vary continuously. And in fact, in that model, the strategic complementarities are so strong that we don't need a strategic leader. Actually, you want to have a high theta, even if the other firm doesn't want to have a theta at all. That moves everybody to a better equilibrium. So, on the energy, maybe this is not at this point the ideal, the interpretation of the model that we have. So one way that we were thinking about this is really this non-excludable learning by doing. This idea is Paul Romer's idea of we create stuff, we create ideas out there in the world. Everybody gets to benefit from using these ideas, and that actually is what leads growth in the end. So we were borrowing kind of that idea of this non-excludable learning by doing things from him, and thinking about, okay, so how do you write that in a model so we wrote it in this particular fashion, and we give it interpretation of these network benefits or the electrical energy savings. Although I agree that maybe not at this point, maybe not the best the best interpretation. Yes.
Rui, we're at time, so thank
Okay.
you so much for a great discussion.